everybody, to the second episode of the Herbalized podcast. Great to have you back. Just want to say thanks so much for the support we've gotten after the last episode. There's been a whole bunch of people getting in touch with us on Instagram, on Facebook. We love to see that. So thanks so much. That's a good way to bring us over to the Herbalized crew shout outs. We did launch our Indiegogo campaign in between last episode and this one. I'll have the details for that in the episode notes. We've had a few donations, so that automatically gets you into the THC crew, the Herbalized crew. So, shout outs. This week we're going out to Jesse I over there at CHANT Down Sound, also the Higher Level Record Shack. If you are a vinyl connoisseur, if you like Jamaican music, here's the guy to see. He hosts a monthly reggae dance here in Melbourne at the MERCAT Cross Hotel. More details for that can be found at chantdown.com. Big shout out to Yonatan from Top Ranking Sound Records. Yoni's doing some amazing stuff, repressing some classic vintage reggae tunes. The boys at Leverage Jiu-Jitsu Academy. Those guys got on board supporting the podcast as well. If you're living out in Melbourne, if you're out in the Thomastown area, check out leveragebjj.com.au. Blazed Australia, no stranger to the local cannabis community here in Australia. Blazed, I'm going to run a competition every now and again through our Instagram, and Blaze was the winner here. I'm going to throw up some eyes, some herbal eyes, some stony eyes, and you just got to guess who the eyes are. And last time was Tommy Chong, and Blaze grabbed that. Blaze is also, we're working together with him at the moment. He's produced a really dope sticker for us, and we're working on some future projects. Going to get some stickers and some t-shirts, and hopefully have him on a future episode. We're going to do a cannabis and art podcast soon. But blazedaustralia.com.au, merchandise for the cannabis enthusiasts, all made and designed here in Australia. Lastly, we've got a sponsor on board as well, the Canna Candy Corp. You search those guys out on Facebook. If you mention the Herbalized podcast, if you order 4 candies, you will get a 5th candy for free. So search the Canna Candy Corp, CCC, on Facebook. The link to that will also be in the episode notes. I know at the end of last episode I said this was going to be a review of Helen Coppolis's film A Life of Its Own, which is an Australian documentary on medicinal cannabis, which I was lucky enough to get along to the world premiere, which was here in Melbourne, and it was a really great film. This is not going to be the review of that film. That's going to come next episode, and the main reason for that is that in between the last episode and this, there was an email that went out from the Office of Drug Control here in Australia announcing some talks that they were going to do on the upcoming changes to legislation and how licensing will be issued for manufacturing and for cultivation. So they've run a series of talks which actually just finished in Perth on the 20th. The website details will be in the office notes. It's the ODC, odc.gov.au. They did say they were going to put the minutes to the presentation up on that website. I haven't seen them up there yet, but what we've got for you in this episode is Loren, who runs This Week in Weed TV, and who very much has his finger on the pulse of the legislation that's unfolding here in Australia. He's an American by birth and spent some time living there and in the UK as well. He was at the talks as well in Melbourne. Well, there's about 100 people in attendance. It was an interesting couple of hours presentation delivered by Bill Turner, who's the head guy at the ODCs. He's basically the guy that's going to be in charge of issuing any licenses that get issued. Admittedly, from the start, they didn't have all the information to give us on the day. The 30th of October 2016, so later this year, is when they're committed to releasing all the information around that in the hopes of having medicine available for patients early 2017. He went into it letting us know that they didn't have all the answers. They had some of the answers. They had some questions. You know, it was all very ambiguous from the start. And at the end of the day, I walked away with a lot more questions than I had answers. Loren was there, I was there, and so what we did is we got together. We basically tried to dissect what happened in that conversation, talk about some of the questions and comments that were raised and made. Yeah, I'll let you guys enjoy. Alright guys, so I am here with Loren from This Week in WeTV. I'm going to hand it over to Loren. He's going to give you a little introduction, tell you a bit about himself.
Hi, I'm Loren. There you go, that's over. Yeah, This Week in WeTV, what we essentially do is we look at all the bills and legislature that's out there, work with all the groups, anybody interested in getting medical cannabis legalized, and just trying to help do it by following the bills and trying to get things looked at and working with the politicians as well. So we're pro law enforcement. Just, you know, the easiest thing to do is make the laws work. Bad laws are bad for law enforcement, so we're just trying to get the laws fixed.
Last week we were both in attendance at a presentation put on by Australia's weed czar, I guess we can start to call him, Mr. Bill Turner, who's in charge of the ODC, which is a branch of the TGA. That's a lot of letters. That's the Therapeutic Goods Association and the Office of Drug Control, who will ultimately be responsible for issuing licenses for growing. And that's what the talks were based around. And that's probably the most insight on the whole thing I'm going to be able to give you. Having just gotten back from travelling overseas, I'm nowhere near as up to date with current legislation as the man beside me. Loren, do you want to give a basic introduction to what happened on the day, and we'll just kind of expand it from there?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that's probably the best thing to do to set the lay of the land. So with the ODC, as you mentioned, working with in the realm of the TGA, they both answer to the Minister of Health. So we're trying to put in place where this all works.
Definitely.
So their boss is effectively the minister. I guess it's just been announced. The timing is good. So I think Susan Ley is keeping her position as a health minister. Mm-hmm. So effectively they're working to Susan Ley. So basically the government, on a federal sense, is put together a framework so that we stay legal within the realms of the UN. And what the ODC are doing effectively are putting together the framework so that essentially cultivators and manufacturers can work together to get patient access. They talk about the most important thing being patient access, but they're also very careful to say they don't write the laws. These are the laws, and within that they're trying to put a process together to do it. So in one essence, it has no relevance if you're not for medical cannabis that has no THC, because I guess we could say there's a war against THC at the moment. Some hemp growers I know in New South Wales, there's I think 85 of them, received letters or were notified that they were changing the definition of hemp from being under 2% THC to under 1% THC. So the licenses up to this point have all been 100% managed by the state, and now the federal side of things is coming over to lay a layer over that, where the state laws still have state laws. They're still relevant, but they also have to answer to Big Daddy or Big Brother, which is this higher level framework, which is trying to work and create things within the scope of the UN. So they kept referring to the Single Use Act, and then Australia did their own version of that to make us fit within the realm of that. So you basically are being told that and I guess we probably talk about the day,
yeah,
is that you have cultivators and manufacturers, and effectively cultivators, growers work with the manufacturers to determine demand. But then they throw in the doctor equation that at the end of the day, your demand has to be based on what the doctor is going to be able to prescribe, because that's the only way you're going to get it. And then they lightly touched on how complicated it was for a doctor to prescribe it.
Yeah.
And effectively, you can't grow any more than there is demand of. So if you're only going to allow it for 1% of the population, that isn't the demand for medical cannabis if you throw in a little equation such as pain relief, which is the number one use of medicinal cannabis globally. America, anywhere, Israel, any country that they're using it for medicinal use, the number one. We just had a symposium here, and they're all from America and all from Israel, Spain. Pain.
Yeah.
What's the only thing they're not allowing any medical treatment for? Pain. So what they're going to allow it for are palliative care, so end of life, or a very rare type of cancer that doesn't need THC. So even then there was the war on THC then.
Yeah.
So all epilepsy benefits, especially the seizure-based epilepsies. We know after it being legal for 20 years already in the States that when you've got epilepsy and seizures, the best treatment is going to be a high THC, low CBD, turned into a concentrate, higher CBD, even higher THC. You kind of go from a 10% to a 60% potency and a 1% or less to maybe a 5% CBD. And that medicine, which was the original Rick Simpson oil, is what has worked on skin cancers, which was designed for cancers, and I'm not going to use the cure word here, but have seen positive effects with cannabis. Cured for some, not cured for others. If it's cured you, then it's cured you. But then they've gone from that scenario to saying, well, you only want to allow it for people that don't need THC. And unfortunately, that's the environment that we're in. And when that got raised at the ODC, his view was, well, the framework is the same whether or not you've got THC in it or you don't.
Yeah.
In this case, nobody can have anything with THC in it in Australia with the new licensing regime, unless they do it as a R&D research license.
Yeah.
Because the bottom line of all this is, how do we evolve? How do we evolve from a scenario where we have something called medical cannabis that could be a synthetic that doesn't even come from a plant, because they've redefined the definition of the word cannabis, like they've done with hemp, and say, look, we don't want people getting high, but if you're going to take this medicine, this is what we're going to do. In California, when we legalized it 20 years ago, the police were very much involved through what they called a group called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They helped framework the laws. So working with law enforcement over there, they spoke up. They worked with the community, they worked with the politicians, they worked with the hippies that made it legal. And the end result was the police had the first money ring-fenced out of the taxes that California paid.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that model unveiled in different ways about how revenue doesn't need to be lost anywhere. There's so many streams for revenue to be generated through whether it's medicinal cannabis or whether it's full-scale recreational cannabis. And, you know, in talking on the day about how, you know, they're going to estimate the amount of cannabis that's going to be required here, they came with some interesting numbers based on data that I'm not really sure how they collected it. But, you know, when we look at the list of groups that they brought up on the day that are going to be their primary focus in getting the medicine to in first instances, and they seem to be fairly committed to working towards this date of the
October 30th.
Yeah, this year. So let's talk about the numbers that they came up with for this first round of patients. The maths at the end of the day that they presented us with is based on 20,000 to 100,000. They very much were sticking to that 20,000 number in all their talks, and that equated to about 2 hectares of indoor space in production. So you know, if the demand is there, then the licenses will be issued for the demand. There's no cap on how many licenses will be issued. Was his firm, you know, proclamation every time anybody touched on the subject. And again referred to the maths of how demand would be mysteriously calculated through doctors, through these patient groups that aren't yet to actually be confirmed. So
this is where they evolved, because at one time they never mentioned the doctors. It was all between the cultivators and the manufacturers dictating demand. Now, what this may also come down to is it may be up to people to, when you say demand, do you mean demand or demand of what is legal? He never used the words, so why should we know what the intent is, but if they never said it, why should we put words in their mouth? So if people come out with, based on what the demand is, if it was going to be available for everybody for every ailment, and a doctor decides, you know, this is what they do in California and most of the world, a doctor decides what ailment you've got and whether or not cannabis will be for it, we know a lot of people in Australia that their GPs are doing just exactly that. They're saying, go buy some cannabis or go get your kids some oil, or nothing else is working for your arthritis, and you don't want to. You still have to survive and have a life. Then, I've seen it, I've heard it, we have all heard it.
For sure.
But that demand is and I asked him the exact question, didn't I?
Yep.
So I said, how do you manage demand on the scenario of the products that the demand is for the products that are not legal? And he said, well, in Victoria, you can do a special access scheme.
Yeah.
I said, so how do you dictate what that demand is? That, it's not even a product that you're offering, but you might be able to get it.
And there are a few different schemes in place. There's two in Victoria. There's at least one in New South Wales where people are getting, in extreme circumstances, access to cannabis and with a tick from the government. And the thing that I guess he's very much constricted by is the United Nations Treaty as well. So a lot of the framework for how medicinal cannabis will work here is all a reflection of that as well. And where other countries have kind of gone so far as to ignore certain parts of what the UN say in regards to cannabis, Australia is not prepared to do that at this stage. So they have to fall in line. And I mean, he talks a lot about the poppy production that we already have in place here, and not wanting to tarnish our name as an amazing opiate producer, and wanting to get this whole system in place and show the world that we can be an amazing medicinal cannabis cultivator.
Yeah, my understanding with the poppy fields, a lot of them in Tasmania and soon in Victoria, is that they're not fenced off necessarily, that you can actually drive by, and there have been some very rare occasional events where kids have gone and grabbed the poppies and then done something stupid and killed themselves. I think there's not been very many, very, very few.
They didn't have alligators or moats around their poppy fields.
Yeah, which was something else that was brought up, which is an interesting point. But the point is that he'd raised in another discussion he had another time, is that it isn't the same threat that there is with cannabis if it was in a field, because I'm not sure you used the word secondary, but opium was harder to get something out of and didn't have the same interest. To have a marijuana field with no fence around it, obviously would be there the next day.
Yeah.
And the fact that you could just have a bonfire and have a party, so I think. So they were concerned about that, and that's why they're also potentially, they've said it before that they were pushing people to be indoors only, because they can't see, and they didn't really said this, but they can't really see people being able to put in enough security for an outside grow.
Yeah.
Even if an outside grow was a better sort of thing, and people in agriculture and farmers and people have been growing, they want to be an outdoor grow. So there isn't any issue with an outdoor grow, but I think they're going to have pretty strict guidelines on security.
Yeah.
And to where if you have a lack of security or a lapse, then you can effectively lose your license, because you're only going to have a license initially for a year anyhow.
Yeah, that's right. And that's some of the things that were covered. So they're talking about 2 levels of licensing: cultivation, manufacturing, and the fact that you can have one, the other, or both.
And then there's multi-levels of permits and things as well as all that. And that's a layer above the state.
Yep.
The state may have some other criteria as well.
Exactly. So we're going to see from that my speculation will be, if they stick to this small demand, it's opening up for like 1 or 2 large scale, completely integrated, manufacturing, cultivation facilities that are going to pop up somewhere in the country.
Can you see a scenario where this isn't locked down by Big Pharma?
No, not with the way it's worded at the moment. It looks like it's a setup for Big Pharma to come in.
Yes. So what happened with the Victoria Law Reform Commission in Australia was they were given a mandate by the government saying, go out and legitimize what we plan to do, which is this. They did that and a bit more than they were ethical about it. They made recommendations back, and then the government only took some of those. Pain management was one of the ones that they raised, and some other issues and the rest of it. So we mentioned the cultivation and manufacturing. They went back and forth, like we talked about, where somebody has to dictate what the demand is going to be, and they have to work. The 2 issues they were worried about was people getting their hands on product that they shouldn't.
Yep.
and the other was in terms of the scope of the UN having too much on hand. You're not allowed to have it sitting around, and if you have bales and bales of cannabis, keeping in mind at this point none of it's got THC in it, but we'll say pretended it did, that sitting around would disappear. What we should have raised the fact is nobody's going to be touching bales and bales of cannabis that's got no THC in it, except as a souvenir.
Yeah, and I guess another point that he really touched on was in applying for the licenses, a stringent thing is going to be able to prove your financial viability.
And associations.
Totally, and a part of that is, they're worried, I'm sure, that they're going to miscalculate either 2 or 4, and somebody's going to produce too much or not enough cannabis. They're going to do all the sums in their heads on the figures the government gives them, and if it falls short, then the government definitely doesn't want to be bailing out, cannabis companies, big pharma or not. So again, for me, I just see more and more this edge towards, just a massive big pharma.
I can't see somebody like Novartis Australia, $100 and something billion company, having distributors and manufacturers of medicinal cannabis that are their part of their family, doing the manufacturing, dictating what's going to go on, because they turn around and say, right, who's the growers? Because one of the things that they mentioned in this was the cultivators, a lot of the growers, they don't know anybody in manufacturing because nobody manufactures cannabis, do they? Because they don't know any manufacturers. They're talking about setting up a matchmaking service between the cultivators and the manufacturers. I saw it happen there. I had the guy that was sitting next to you.
Totally.
He said, I've got the growing, we're doing a potential opportunity here, and but I don't know any manufacturers. Well, manufacturers aren't allowed to touch anything with THC above 2%. It's the law, unless you have an R&D license.
Yeah.
So who are you going to talk to? You have to talk to them in the context. Hypothetically speaking, we're talking to you about less than 2% THC. If it's going to be more than 2% THC, you're still happy to make the medicine, the rest of it. But the other thing I asked them very early on was when they legalized medicinal cannabis on Earth, starting with California in 1996, they put the framework in place with a view that this is 110% medicinal cannabis only, but if it works, there's no point reinventing the wheel to move to a recreational model. He was not very happy when I raised that point to him.
He wasn't.
And said, are you creating a framework that can evolve into something so you're not having to reinvent the wheel again, or will it not work that way? And he basically said bluntly, this isn't the forum for that conversation. And he wasn't nice about it. I mean, he wasn't bubbly. He changed from bubble.
Straightforward.
He was very straightforward, yes. Professional straightforward.
Yes.
He really didn't throw anything at me, which he could have done.
He did, though, after, letting you know that it wasn't the forum for that kind of question, and he finished it off with an odd kind of flippant remark that, he does sometimes envision a time where he might be kept awake at night as this kind of cannabis tax man.
So yeah, he was worried about the fact, because I said to him, this could, what happens when it goes recreational, you got to reinvent the wheel and the rest of it. And he goes, no, this won't do it because, and I also have nightmares that I'll be the one collecting the taxes from the recreational users if it did go that way. So I don't know, and it's hard to tell when you're talking to the man that, because you got to remember that we should have started this whole conversation off saying that when this whole thing started, he said there's basically things he knows that are facts that he can tell us about, and I was thinking of Rumsfeld with this. There's things he knows that are facts that he can tell us. There's things that he knows are facts that he can't tell us, and there's things that they don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, judging by the output of the whole thing, you probably couldn't tell the difference between, because if the scope of it was they're not tell us the truth anyhow, it doesn't really matter because the stuff we do know we're going to make up and tell you a different form of. We're not filling the gaps for you.
Yeah.
We don't make the laws. We're not telling you what's wrong. We're trying to make work what we've got to work with.
Yeah.
And if it so happens to be it doesn't have any THC and nobody's ever going to ever want it, this is why you don't have a 1-year license as well.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps he's trying to, cement some sort of place in history, but we talk about reinventing the wheel, and that was mentioned many times throughout the discussion, because in talking about the potential first round of patients And look, I understand that there's a real importance to prioritize, somebody who has a terminal disease that cannabis can help manage in any way, shape or form should definitely get access to it in a country where the frameworks are still working out before somebody who has lower back pains, okay? It's viable for both conditions, but I don't see the problem in trying to get access to people first when supplies may be limited. What comes from that is, there's a lot of research out there already across the world, in Israel, in the United States. It's out there. It's definitely happening. It's happening here in Australia. Why not have a look and pay attention to that kind of work rather than letting a free market situation open up where people are free to produce the medicine, and if the use is there, it'll get sold.
Yeah, you raise a few interesting points. One of the things that he talked about was the most important thing that they were going to reference there was effectively the UN law, the Single-Use Act of things. And this is where it gets very interesting as well. With the Single-Use Act, they're very clear to point out, well, they weren't very clear to point out, but it's there, that trafficking is the bad thing, cannabis is a narcotic, trafficking is a bad thing, but personal use, in the midst of tearing the details of that apart, personal use is fine. So one of the interesting things that's happened since is they lowered the benchmark of what trafficking is from personal use, because if people were making oil that need more plant than a single plant, and that winds up 10 plants, and now you're into trafficking, even though you're doing one thing for one person. And the fact that it's in there as being a narcotic. Well, definitions evolve. This is a very old document. The definitions are wrong. So we're trying to put a framework in around something that is tainted and not right to begin with.
And a redefinition of it, a rescheduling of cannabis, is potentially going to throw all of this out of whack and require a new framework to be put in place for some serious readjustments anyway.
And we're ignoring the fact that how much of the world are actually offering medicinal cannabis. So the fact, we're not the first country to be doing this. We're the last of 15 or where we're up to now in terms of countries. Yes, they haven't got it right in the States, but the end user experience, if you're a sick person needing medicine, you can get it, you can go to a dispensary. If you're in a state that only does medicinal, which is now over half the country, then you can get medicine. And recreational is in 4 and 5. But you can get the medicine, so that bit works. The other thing he mentioned multiple times before this event and another one is the fact that they're using Canada as the model. Well, Canada is two things. A, pretty messed up at the moment, but the other thing is it's evolving to something completely different next year anyhow. So to pick a embryotic, flawed model and then use that as your benchmark, well, you've got problems to begin with as well. So this is the other problem that they're making. Where Jamaica, which we were just talking about before, Jamaica's part of the Commonwealth. Prior to the UN catastrophes with the Brexit, they had a bill in the UK that, if it was a private member's bill, but it had some teeth from Norman Lamb. Anything that happens in the Commonwealth is a pretty good thing. Canada's evolving. The new prime minister there has come in based on the basis he's going to legalize cannabis and he'll do it next year. So that's on track to do that. The UK is a mixed bag. We have police coming out in the UK now saying they're not going to arrest people anymore publicly in the newspaper. So this isn't like, I just want to arrest it. This is publicly in the newspaper. So the mindset over there is evolving. And Jamaica's already there. And New Zealand may be getting ahead of us as well.
Right. And a part of his justification was the Single-Use Act.
So Bill Turner talked about working with constitutional lawyers. If you went to a constitutional lawyer saying, we want to take this direction and this perspective, you need to take us this direction and this perspective. If you were another person that said, well, we want to do and offer it with THC and everything and screw the Single-Use Act, that isn't what the requirement is. That is a possibility. But because of what's been going on with the hemp growers and the way this is going to where they're starting to potentially reinterpret UN acts. There was a Royal Commission years back, around '84, the Sackville Royal Commission on drug use. They looked at cannabis and they talked about specifically that the idea of limiting personal use and making trafficking, lowering the benchmark on trafficking like we're talking about, is a misinterpretation in Australia. I see that coming up in courts if it already hasn't, because somebody could have already taken this to court.
Yeah.
And won,
Yeah,
and we
right.
wouldn't necessarily know about it.
Yeah.
I know there's some lawyers up in New South Wales that have been doing some good things, and we're getting some special access schemes through.
Yeah.
He mentioned there's a lot of people getting special access, but I don't think those numbers are accurate, and I'll be looking more into that. One of the schemes in New South Wales, which is a joke that people need to be worried about, and every special access scheme is with the TICS program in New South Wales. They were on TV, the chief of police up there, talking about the fact that more people were arrested for signing up for the program than were in the program, because part of the criteria is to check to see if you're a fair and reasonable person to be able to get medical cannabis. And they show up and knock on your door, and you let them in, and you've got plants growing, or you're a sick person, you've got medical cannabis there because you need medical cannabis, which is why you're applying to get legally.
Yep.
And they're arresting people and preventing them from going on the program.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a really good model.
Yeah.
One thing we need to know is if special access schemes are working, because we're across all the groups, but sometimes somebody may not be in a group and still have life happening to them.
Yeah.
So if people are having issues in court and are trying on these sort of things or special access schemes, we'd love to hear about it. I talked to the law groups in Victoria. We have LIV, the Law Institute of Victoria, and but that's not happening. They're not seeing anybody winning anything like this per se with their lawyers.
Another thing he mentioned in being bound by the single act is where, if you are approved for licensing and cultivation, where you're going to be able to source genetics from. And so, I mean, he's unable to look to any model that's happening in the US because federally they're illegal, and because they're all, run by different state laws, and it's probably fair to say that none of them fall within the Single Use Act. He can't use any of those to model it on, and none of those seed banks or genetic companies will be approved for sourcing seeds. I think he mentioned, he mentioned Canada.
Yep.
He mentioned
Holland. From the one supplier, because they only have one.
Yep. And he hinted at the possibilities of Israel as well.
Yeah.
And that was
so
pretty much those three.
USA was off the table because it's illegal federally, means they can't export. This is something I didn't think about at all.
Yeah.
And this is something I don't even know if they've pushed that issue in the States.
Yeah.
Because there's
Well,
a
I'm
huge...
sure there are seed companies exporting seeds.
No, I know, but not
it's all-
legally.
Yeah, exactly.
But they once they did that, it isn't so much that, but plant material and the rest of it. There's a huge agricultural opportunity there. But the way I've used an analogy on this whole thing is that effectively they're saying, well, we're reinventing the wheel and all this, and the only criteria for reinventing the wheel is round is off the table. And this makes it very aggravating. So 20 years ago when they legalized it, the framework exists. It was flawed, but we've now got 26 states, 26 iterations of what wasn't very good 20 years ago. You've now got Colorado. They're giving back to schools. They're giving people back money. The economy is changing. The police are happy. The police are getting more money. They're getting more resources. I've had many a conversation when I was in Denver last year, talking to the police officers, almost teary-eyed the fact that they're now able, they don't have to enforce bad laws, and they'd rather be dealing with people that have never had a drug overdose from a product like cannabis in their life, and people are drinking less alcohol, which is the other benefit of this. Less drunkards in the street, with all the stuff that goes up in Sydney and Melbourne and the rest of it,
And smoking less pot too.
And smoking less pot.
Yeah, I mean that's what evidence is starting to suggest just about everywhere, that whether it's recreational or medicinal cannabis is coming in, pot use, particularly amongst younger people, is on the decline. So it's an interesting thing to see, and as we watch it unfold here, like I said, a lot more questions than answers at the end of this talk.
But there's some telltale things. For instance, the fact that they seem more concerned about cannabis than they do about opium. Going back to the scenario that you didn't have to have the security around the opium poppy fields that you do around the cannabis, and if opium was that way, you could just grab it and smoke it right there. It would change the whole dynamic of that. I mean, it's kind of amazing there aren't more people that have gotten sick or died from grabbing the poppies, but
Right.
nobody could be asked, and nobody wants to do something that's going to kill them. I guess is the other thing. Well, nobody's ever been sick or anything more than that.
And he's stressed security. I mean, to the point of being a bit silly about it. He talked about it being quite stringent, and there'll be certain guidelines you have to meet. If you in your application want to exceed those guidelines, and he kept referring to this
moats with alligators.
Yeah, a moat full
so
of alligators.
If we tell you to put in a moat, and you said, "Yeah, but I want to add crocodiles as well,"
we're gonna.
Then you better make sure there's crocodiles in there.
When we come and check the facility, we want to see the crocodiles.
So the secret there is you're going to tell them you're going to put in the minimum amount of security, and if you're going to do something else, that's great, but don't say you're going to do more than the minimum.
Yeah, watch out what you commit to.
And the other thing he was quick to point out there too was people were talking about their business. So depending on what people were doing there, some of the activity they might be doing is illegal today because the laws are broken.
Mm-hmm.
So what he was saying was, if you do something illegal, don't tell me you're doing something illegal if you're going for a license, because I can't unknow what you've told me.
Yeah, I mean, being of good moral character, or I forget the exact terminology, but that was a big part of, he is going to determine whether you're a good enough person to be able to grow.
And he loves that part. I guess in one respect, if somebody says you're going to be responsible for something, and the only way you can trust nobody to mess up is if you're doing it yourself. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he'll have everybody doing the other work, and he'll do the sign-off once they've done the background checks, because it wasn't just, I mean, he made a joke out of this. It was quite funny. It's like, if you're a big-time drug dealer and been in prison for that, then obviously you're not going to get a license. If your father was a big-time drug dealer and you get money from him from his tainted fruit, then you won't get a license. But if your father's a big-time, and then it goes on in these scenarios, and at the end of the day, the end result is if they even have a hint of a hint of a hint that they're of dubious character, not sufficient quality. And again, if you go back to scenarios, well, if you ruled out individuals and went businesses and pharmaceutical companies, that problem goes away.
Straight away.
So if they're creating a criteria that potentially nobody can meet,
yes,
because everybody's connected to somebody else by 6 people, and they decide to make it 8, then everybody's going to know somebody. And we're in Australia, folks. You don't have to go back too many generations to find there may be a criminal in your ancestry.
He's set up some very ambiguous frameworks for issuing licenses. Again, the models that they're basing themselves on, apart from Canada, but being able to only really look at Israel and the Netherlands. I mean, Israel has an amazing medicinal cannabis scheme going, because there's a lot of access for people, but it's also heavily monopolised.
Exactly.
Which is something that I probably foresee in Australia's cannabis future.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I think they like the Israel model. The other thing he raised and emphasized, and again, because they weren't particularly clear on things, you have to think about what he did say. The fact that he hinted that doctors were not going to be encouraged to prescribe cannabis, and part of the demand has to be based on doctors.
If we can't get the doctors on board, folks, this thing won't get legs.
So where our focus will need to be for people that are going to be talking to doctors is talking to doctors that aren't part of the AMA, because the Australian Medical Association has not been particularly conducive to liking the idea of medicinal cannabis, or worse, they've gone further than that. And of course, we're forgetting about the scenario that up to this point, we're not talking about anything entering or being available in Australia that's got THC in it. So they're talking about being worried about marijuana laying around, cannabis lying around, but we're not talking about anything with THC. So at the moment, no state is allowing any product in that's got THC in it, and New South Wales and Queensland have lowered the definition of hemp from 2% THC to 1% THC. So we're not going the right way here. Especially when we're talking oil, we're talking CBD oils. And I think there's a view that if they run these tests for 3 to 5 years with no THC, and that works, or they decide whether or not they like the idea of the business model, Big Pharma says, yeah, okay, let's open the doors. Then they go to other symptoms, they're still a very long ways from doing anything. And people have talked a generation being 10 years, 15 years. That's what we're potentially talking about. But the problem is, in the meantime, they're not talking at all about self-grows. There is no self-grows.
Yeah.
Special access scheme is product. But even some of the special access schemes that they have allowed people to do it, they say, go ahead.
Yeah.
I go, what about product? Well, we're not providing the product.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want to do,
Yeah.
but everybody you're buying it from is doing something illegal. You're not. You can buy it, but they can't sell it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of grey areas in there. I mean, another thing he was talking about was the initial round of licensing will be for a year.
Yes.
The first year, he also stressed that there was nothing for exports.
No.
It was potentially in the future, more than likely in the future, but they weren't going to put anything in the framework at this stage for it. So even if you're there and you've got a bunch of excess product that ends up having to be destroyed under the Single Use Act, you can't find a legitimate way to export it and send it overseas and recoup some losses.
There aren't a lot of companies that would want to import nuclear waste. In this particular case, they're looking to export product that's got no THC in it. What country wants to buy cannabis that doesn't have THC in it? They already have that product. It's called hemp. Some of the hemp that's being grown in Australia by good farmers, 2% THC, keeping the full entourage effect. They've got a hemp product. That's effectively what they're going to allow you to grow some form of. Meanwhile, the hemp growers are going, well, what about us? We're already doing that.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking at the priority of who should be available to have it, you would think hemp farmers should have it pretty well nailed.
Yeah.
Big Pharma, the government may have them pretty well nailed. Joe Blogg's the entrepreneur that wants to work with the manufacturer to be able to do it. And they've lowered the standard of the pharmaceutical manufacturer from being huge to complementary medicines standard. Yeah. Which that affects, I guess, who those manufacturers potentially could be.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
some of the people there were ready to go. They had they've been in the media. They've got the growing. They've got the manufacturer who, if it evolves beyond 2% THC, they'll touch that as well. They're just waiting for the green light to be able to go. But keeping in mind, well, what demand are you going to provide for? The manufacturer may have a demand. Well, I can't turn on the lights for less than $1 million.
Yeah.
And the grower might say, well, I can't afford to do a grow for less than $1 million. Well, you may only need 2 licenses in Victoria, and Big Pharma's in front of me.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So it's what we don't know that we don't know. Back to it again.
Exactly, and he called it the 2016 tour of disappointment with a little grin on his face as well. And you know, I'm sure there were people sitting in there with big dreams and big hopes.
95% of the people probably didn't get it.
Yeah.
Because those that asked the questions, that were passionate about the questions, that knew what they were asking, you didn't hear the sneers and snickerings that I would have expected if people realized what was actually being asked.
Yeah.
That's why I was trying to be blunt and clear about. But when I said it that way, we get to get a few moans then. When I say, if you're asking us to put demand for a product based on a product that is no demand, and the product that there is demand for, we're not allowed to put in for the demand, then how do we address that?
Yeah.
That's when the crickets were there. His look and his demeanor changed, and he wasn't a happy camper.
Yeah.
You know, he'd been caught with his hand on the cookie jar.
Yeah.
So it comes down, I think, to a couple of things. One is getting people active to raise the issues, to raise the concern. Join a group. We all need a group, 12-step program or a group. Join a group such as the MCUA, the Medical Cannabis Users Association, or any of the others that are out there. Be part of what's going on. Use social media to query why are we, this isn't about the fact that Mike Baird in New South Wales is saying this is taking too long. He's progressing things, but they're going down the wrong path. The path they're taking us down, one is medical cannabis with no cannabis in it. If you look at the laws in Queensland, where they've recently even changed the definition of a synthetic opioid, substance, which is fentanyl, which is the drug that recently Prince died of an overdose of. They've recategorized that in the official Queensland document that's on the website public, they've reclassified that as a cannabinoid, and they've reclassified all cannabinoids and synthetics as cannabis. So cannabis is no longer a plant, it is a bucket with the name cannabis on it, and that can be a synthetic that doesn't even come from a plant. It can be, per the legislature, it could be something that acts like cannabis. Opioids again. So this way farmers managing, and this is Queensland. New South Wales is not done anything yet, but there's something coming in New South Wales. There'll be a new bill for that.
Yeah.
And then the bills that have passed in Victoria still got some fine-tuning to do with over 400 amendments that have been made to the Victorian one to put it in line with a federal one that hasn't come out yet. So we've got at least 2 new bills. Queensland's ongoing at the moment. New South Wales that we've not even seen yet. The federal one will have another layer on top of it after October 30th, I would say.
Yeah.
And people need to get involved. So I guess the issue is that the framework is in place, but effectively what wasn't said is that you can only put in demand and things for things that are legal. So what those that are putting the demand need to do, and if you get in touch with me, and we work across all the groups, we've got a better feel for what demand really is, and there's information that's out there as well. It will be up to those that are dictating what the demand is to push the definition of the demand for what the demand really is, not what the laws are prohibiting it from being.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the really big push. Look, it was a confusing talk. Bill Turner did a great job at making it entertaining to disguise a lot of disappointment and a lot of filler. If you're feeling a little bit disheartened, stay tuned. It's not necessarily all bad.
This is why we're changing and trying to fix the laws.
Exactly. But thanks for tuning in, guys. We appreciate it. Loren, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.
It's been a great chat. Yeah, thanks very much. There you go, guys. That was Loren from This Week in Weed TV and our breakdown of the talk we attended with Bill Turner from the Office of Drug Control. A lot more questions at the end of the day than there were answers, but it certainly seems that they are committed to having it all nailed out later on this year. So as it gets closer to that, as that happens, we'll be sure to keep you in touch. Stay tuned for the next episode. It will be the review of Helen Coppolas's film A Life of Its Own. We're going to sit down with Helen later on this week, if all goes well as just do a bit of a review about the film too. As far as what's coming up for the podcast, all the usual things: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Anybody interested in sponsoring or getting involved, we're going to start launching some videos on the YouTube. We've got the Ozbongs coming in September. Pretty excited about that and looking forward to doing an unboxing on the YouTube channel. Alright guys, so that was episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned to episode 3. Check out the episode notes for all the details on how to find, subscribe, support, and we'll see you soon. Stay Herbalized.